I'd been scrolling through job listings online for hours, feeling the familiar frustration of a tight job market in a small town. There weren't many options here. With just 5,000 people living in this place, it seemed like every available job had been taken, or worse, disappeared by the time you were ready to apply. I was driving back and forth to college and needed something to pay the bills. Then out of nowhere, something caught my eye. A job listing for a general custodian at a local morgue. I'll be honest, the thought of working in a place like that immediately turned my stomach. The idea of being surrounded by the dead just creeped me out. But as I read the job description, something about it felt different. It didn't require interacting with the bodies or anything grim like that. It was mostly just cleaning up, making sure things were tidy. I figured, why not? A job's a job, right? So I called the next day and spoke to the guy who ran the place. Or at least I thought he was the owner. He sounded eager, almost desperate. "Come down today," he told me. "I'll show you around." I was ready in an hour. The morgue was located just on the edge of town, tucked behind an old industrial park that seemed to have more weeds than businesses. Mark, the guy who greeted me at the door, looked like he'd seen better days. Middle-aged, hair graying at the temples, but he had a firm handshake and a smile that almost seemed too polite to be real. "Jimmy, right?" he asked, as if he'd never seen me before. "Yeah, that's me," I said, forcing a smile. Mark showed me around the building, and truth be told, the place wasn't as bad as I'd imagined. The floors were old and cracked in places, and the walls had that faint smell of antiseptic that seemed to linger no matter how hard they tried to air the place out. He led me through a small hallway, past the common room, where the TV sat quietly in the corner, and into a much darker section at the back. "This is the body room," Mark said, his voice dropping. It was dimly lit, and as I glanced inside, I could make out the outlines of large metal shelves where the deceased were stored. It was cold. The kind of cold that seeps into your bones and makes you want to hurry up and leave. I didn't linger. Mark explained that I'd be responsible for cleaning the common areas, mowing the lawn once a week, and other odd jobs around the place. Nothing too tough. He also mentioned the back lawn that needed regular mowing. It was just a job, nothing more. Easy enough, right? I was on the job the very next day. Mark wasn't much of a conversationalist, mostly keeping to himself and retreating into his office. The hours passed slowly. I spent most of my shifts mopping floors, tidying up the yard, and trying to stay busy. But there were always those quiet, eerie moments, the feeling that you were being watched, that something was just off about the whole place. One night around 10 p.m., I was cleaning the floor in the common room when I heard a noise, a shuffle. I turned, expecting to see Mark, but there was no one. The silence hung in the air. I shook it off as nothing, just the creaking of an old building. But the air felt thick, like something was about to happen. I'd been working there for a couple of weeks when Mark started to open up a bit more. One afternoon, while we were eating lunch together, barbecue sandwiches from the place down the street, he mentioned that I was the first person to stick around for longer than a few days. The others had either quit or just left. He sounded so lonely when he said it, like he was genuinely trying to make a connection, but I couldn't help feeling like something was missing from his story. That night, things started getting weird. Mark, who usually didn't show much emotion, suddenly stormed out of the body room, slamming the door behind him so hard it bounced back open a little. I was mopping the floor when I caught a glimpse of him, eyes wild, face flushed. "Everything okay?" I asked cautiously. He didn't answer right away. Instead, he grunted and headed back to his office, leaving me alone in the common room. I finished cleaning, but something about the way he acted unsettled me. Later, as I was finishing up the last of my chores, I heard another shuffle. I froze, the hairs on the back of my neck standing up. It wasn't Mark this time. I walked toward the body room, my footsteps echoing too loud in the quiet. The door was slightly ajar. Hesitant, I pushed it open, and that's when I noticed something strange. The two racks furthest from the door had padlocks on them. Chills ran down my spine. What was going on? I stood there, staring at those locks, when the front door opened. Mark walked in like nothing was wrong, shutting the door behind him and locking it with a key. He barely acknowledged me. "You good?" I asked, voice shaky. "Just got caught up with the power box," he said, brushing past me. "Everything's fine." But was it? The whole place felt like it was hiding something. The air was thick with tension, and I couldn't shake the feeling that someone or something was watching me. The next night, I had to run an errand for Mark, go pick up snacks from the corner store. I hated going there so late. The place always felt deserted, like a ghost town. When I came back to the morgue, the power was out. No lights. Everything was dark. I stood there for a moment, staring at the building, trying to shake off the unease crawling up my spine. I called out for Mark, but there was no answer. The door to the body room stood wide open. I hesitated, but my curiosity got the better of me. Slowly, I stepped inside, my heart hammering in my chest. That's when I noticed the locks again. I stepped back and looked around. I didn't know what was happening, but everything about this place felt wrong. Mark came rushing in, face flushed, out of breath. "Don't go in there," he snapped. "Everything's fine. I just needed to check on some things. I didn't buy it." That night, as I prepared to leave, I felt like something was about to snap. I could feel Mark's eyes on me, watching, waiting. It was only when I reached my car that I realized I'd left my phone and wallet inside. I cursed under my breath, annoyed, but couldn't shake the feeling of dread that followed me back inside the building. The lights were off again, but this time there was something more menacing about the way the place stood silent in the dark. When I stepped in, I saw Mark peeking out through the blinds of his office. It made my blood run cold. I quickly grabbed my things and left, the nagging sense of being watched creeping along my skin. The next day, everything seemed normal again. The grass was freshly mowed, the floors spotless. But when I entered the building, I could feel it. Mark was different. "Hey, Jimmy," he said, his tone too cheerful. "You've been working hard." I nodded, but couldn't shake the feeling that I was being pulled into something deeper. I walked past him, trying not to make eye contact. He was always lurking, watching. But I wasn't sure if he was the one who needed watching most. I glanced back once more, and for a split second I thought I saw something shift in the shadows. It was late evening when I stumbled upon the job listing. I had been scrolling aimlessly, hoping for something, anything, to pop up. You see, I just moved to this tiny town a few months ago, and finding a decent job was like trying to catch a shadow. The place had only around 3,000 people, and it felt like everyone knew everyone else's business. Jobs here didn't come easy. You'd blink, and the best ones were gone before you even had a chance to apply. Then, there it was, a listing for a night custodian at a local mortuary. I'll admit the thought of working in a place like that made me feel queasy, but the job description seemed so simple, just general maintenance and cleaning, no interaction with the bodies, no gruesome tasks. I figured it couldn't hurt to call. What did I have to lose? The next day I made the call. The man on the other end, a gruff voice, sounded eager, almost too eager. "Come by now," he said. "I'll show you around." I didn't waste time. 30 minutes later, I was on my way to the outskirts of town. The mortuary was tucked away behind a patch of industrial buildings, forgotten by time, surrounded by overgrown weeds and rusted machinery, the kind of place where no one came unless they had to. I pulled up, feeling an odd mix of nervousness and curiosity. The man who met me at the door was Mark. At least, that's what he told me his name was. He looked worn, like someone who had been carrying a heavy load for too long. His hair was thinning, graying at the edges, and his clothes looked a size too big. But his handshake was firm, his smile too wide. "You're Jimmy, right?" he asked, as if the idea of meeting a new person was foreign to him. "Yeah, that's me," I said, forcing a smile. I wasn't sure why I was nervous, but the hairs on the back of my neck stood up as soon as I stepped inside. I started the very next day. Mark kept mostly to himself, retreating to his office while I worked. The hours were long and the tasks were monotonous. But there was something about the place that made me uneasy. I couldn't put my finger on it, like I was being watched, like something was always just out of sight. A few weeks in, I started to notice odd things. Small details, really, but enough to raise my eyebrows. I was cleaning the break room one night when I heard a shuffle, like someone was walking behind me. I spun around, expecting to see Mark, but there was no one. The silence that followed was thick, unsettling. I brushed it off as nothing, just the sounds of an old building settling, but something about it didn't sit right with me. Later that week, I was having lunch with Mark, barbecue sandwiches from a local diner. He was unusually talkative, mentioning that I was the longest-lasting employee he'd had. The others, he said, had either quit or vanished within a few days. He chuckled nervously, but I could hear the loneliness in his voice. He didn't seem like the type to open up to anyone, yet here he was, sharing bits of his life with me. Then, the weirdness really began. I was cleaning the floor one night when Mark burst out of the back room, his face pale, his eyes wide. He slammed the door behind him so hard it bounced back open. "Everything okay?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. Mark didn't respond right away. He just stood there for a moment, staring at the door like he was trying to process something. Then he grunted and walked toward his office without saying another word. I was left standing there, confused and unsettled. It wasn't long before I saw something that sent a chill through me. Late one night, as I was finishing up, I heard a shuffle again. This time it was louder. I froze, every muscle tensing. The sound seemed to be coming from the body room. Hesitant, I walked toward it, the hall feeling colder as I approached. The door was ajar. I pushed it open, my heart pounding. That's when I saw the padlocks. 2 of the racks in the back had heavy locks on them, the kind you only use for something you want to keep hidden. I stood there, my mind racing, but before I could process what I was seeing, the front door creaked open and Mark walked in, acting like nothing was wrong. He locked the door behind him and barely glanced at me. "I had to check on something," he muttered, brushing past me without explaining further. I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The whole place felt like it was hiding something dark. The next day, Mark was acting strange, too cheerful, almost too eager to make small talk. "Good work, Jimmy," he said with a grin that didn't quite reach his eyes. "You're a hard worker." I nodded, trying to keep my unease at bay. But as I walked past him, I caught him staring at me for just a second longer than was comfortable. His eyes were filled with something I couldn't identify. Maybe it was guilt, or maybe fear. That night I had to run a quick errand for Mark, picking up snacks from the local store. It was late, and the town felt deserted. When I got back to the mortuary, the power was out. The building stood there, dark and silent. I hesitated for a moment, the hairs on my neck prickling with unease. I called out for Mark, but there was no answer. I pushed open the door, my stomach in knots. I didn't know why, but something about this place felt wrong. As I stepped into the dark hallway, I saw the body room door wide open again. This time, I didn't hesitate. I walked in, and the locks were still there, still the same, but now they felt heavier, more menacing. Before I could take another step, Mark rushed in, his face flushed and panicked. "Don't go in there," he snapped, his voice sharp. "Everything's fine. Just had to take care of something." But I didn't believe him. I couldn't. Later, as I was preparing to leave for the night, I realized I'd forgotten my wallet and phone. I groaned in frustration, but something urged me to go back inside. The lights were off again. and the stillness of the place felt more oppressive than ever. When I stepped back in, I saw Mark staring at me from the shadows of his office. His eyes were wide, unblinking. I grabbed my things quickly and left, my heart pounding in my chest. The next day, everything seemed fine. The lawn was freshly mowed, the floors sparkling. But something was different about Mark. His smile was too wide, too practiced. "Good work, Jimmy," he said, his voice dripping with something I couldn't place. "You're really proving yourself." As I walked past him, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being drawn into something darker than I was ready for. I glanced back once, and for a split second I saw something shift in the shadows of the building. I couldn't ignore it anymore. I was trapped, and whatever was lurking in those shadows was closer than I realized. It was well past sunset when I found it, the job listing that would change everything. I had been aimlessly scrolling through job boards for what felt like hours, hoping for a miracle. I'd only moved to this sleepy town a couple of months ago, and despite its size, only about 2,500 people, finding a job felt like chasing a dream. Everyone seemed to know everyone else's business, and jobs were either taken by family or gone in the blink of an eye. And then I saw it. A listing for an overnight custodian at a local funeral home. My first reaction was unease. I mean, who would want to work somewhere like that? The thought of being surrounded by death, even if it was just cleaning floors and sweeping up, made my stomach turn. But the job description was simple. No interactions with bodies, general cleaning and maintenance duties. It seemed like it could be straightforward. What did I have to lose? I called the number the next morning, and the voice on the other end didn't waste any time. "Come by now, I'll show you the place," said a gruff, almost too eager voice. So I did. Half an hour later, I found myself driving down a narrow, cracked road, heading toward the outskirts of town. The funeral home was tucked behind a row of dilapidated buildings, lost to time. The area was quiet, almost forgotten. Overgrown weeds creeping up against the rusting edges of abandoned machinery. A place where only the desperate or the unfamiliar would find themselves. The man who greeted me at the door looked like he hadn't seen the light of day in a long time. Mark, he said his name was. He was older than I expected, probably in his late 40s, with thinning hair and clothes that hung off him like he didn't care. His handshake was firm, but his smile was wide and uncomfortable. "You're the new guy?" he asked, his voice gruff but oddly warm. "Yeah, that's me," I answered, forcing a smile. I wasn't sure why, but my instincts were already on edge. Something about the way he stood there made my skin prickle. I started my shift the very next night. Mark was almost never around. He stayed in his office, only emerging for short, routine checks. The work was dull and the hours dragged on. But something about the place started to unsettle me. At first, it was just little things. The way the lights flickered, the strange silence that seemed to hang in the air, the odd feeling that I was never truly alone. It was as if there was something hidden just behind the walls, watching me. One night, as I wiped down the counters in the break room, I heard a shuffle. I turned around, thinking Mark had come in, but there was no one. The silence that followed was thick, pressing in on me. I told myself it was nothing, just the house settling, old walls creaking under the weight of time. But even as I tried to ignore it, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The weirdness escalated a few days later when Mark invited me to lunch. We ate sandwiches from a local deli, and I learned a bit more about him. His awkward, stilted speech hinting at a loneliness I hadn't expected. He mentioned how I was the longest any employee had lasted here. The others had quit or disappeared after just a few days. He laughed nervously as he spoke, but his eyes didn't match his smile. Then, things took a darker turn. It was a quiet night, and I was mopping the floor near the back room when Mark burst out, his face pale, his eyes wide like he had just seen something he wasn't supposed to. He slammed the door behind him so hard it bounced back open. "Everything okay?" I asked, trying to sound calm. Mark didn't answer right away. He just stood there, staring at the door like he was waiting for something. When he spoke, his voice was hoarse. "Yeah, just..." He cut himself off and walked toward his office without another word. I stood there, confused, unsure of what I had just witnessed. That wasn't the last strange occurrence. One evening, while I was finishing up my shift, I heard the shuffle again. This time it was louder. I froze, feeling my pulse quicken. The sound was coming from the body room. Against every instinct I had, I walked toward the door, hesitant but curious. It was slightly ajar. When I opened it, my heart dropped. Two of the metal racks in the back of the room had large padlocks on them, thick old locks that looked out of place in a place like this. I stood there staring at them, unsure what I was looking at. Before I could process it any further, I heard the front door creak open. Mark had returned. He locked the door behind him, as if everything was normal. "I had to check something," he muttered, brushing past me without another word. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The place felt like it was hiding something dark. The next day, Mark was acting strange, almost overly cheerful. "Good job last night, Jimmy," he said with a forced grin. "You're a real hard worker." I nodded, trying to keep my composure, but as I walked past him, I caught a glimpse of something in his eyes. It was a look I couldn't describe. Fear? Guilt? Whatever it was, it didn't sit right with me. That night, the power went out. I had just returned from a quick errand to the store, late, the streets empty. And when I stepped into the darkened building, I called out for Mark. But there was no answer. I felt a knot twist in my stomach. Something about this night felt wrong in a way I couldn't explain. The hallways were dark and the body room door was wide open again. I hesitated for only a moment before walking inside. The locks were still there, the same heavy ones, but this time they felt even more ominous. Just as I took a step closer, Mark appeared, rushing into the room, his face flushed and his movements frantic. "Don't go in there," he snapped, his voice sharp. "Everything's fine, just had to take care of something." I didn't believe him, not for a second. I knew then that something was being hidden from me, something I wasn't meant to know. And I wasn't going to stop until I figured out what it was.